Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. As the title for this video no doubt shows, I'm talking about the history of torture. For this reason, it's important, I think, to issue a content or trigger warning. Some of the acts that I will be describing, some of the images I will be using are not going to be suitable for all audiences. If you think that you will find this content disturbing, please click away now. I have lots of other videos on my channel that you can check out. I'd love to know what you think of them. If you are sticking around, thank you. It will not be my intention to be graphic or gratuitous in my descriptions where possible. I am choosing to describe these acts as they happened or as they were alleged to have happened because I think it's important to provide that context when we are talking about how we figure or understand torture in our own history. With that being said, I do hope you find this content interesting and I'd love to know what you think in the comment section. But for now, let's talk torture. I was inspired to make this video and to talk about this topic because of something I saw while I was bumbling about on YouTube the other day. Somebody has uploaded the two-part mini-series of Henry VIII from 2003, which has Ray Winstone in the title role. In that mini-series, the Duke of Buckingham is played by Charles Dance, who I'm sure many of you will recognise a lot better for playing Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones, along with many other film and TV credits. Charles Dance's character, much like the historical Duke of Buckingham, has quite a lot of royal blood in his veins. He also potentially has a better claim to the throne of England than Henry VIII does. And unfortunately for both the historical figure and Charles Dance's character, it's very likely that he was keen to push that claim. He is accused, convicted, and after his death, funnily enough, attainted for treason. Now, in the mini-series, what's interesting is we see Charles Dance's character hanging from the ceiling in manacles, shirtless, with red-hot pokers being applied to his naked flesh. And there is no evidence that this ever took place in the historical record. The Duke of Buckingham was executed and suffered a traitor's death on Tower Hill in 1521. Executions are brutal, as are public shaming punishments. They are torturous, I would argue, cruel and unusual. But when I'm going to be talking about torture today, I am talking about the sorts of things that happen in dungeons, in basements, away from prying eyes. These are private moments, perhaps intended to elicit confessions or the names of accomplices. My question is, why are they being added in when there is no historical record that they ever occurred? Why does film and TV that deals with the medieval and early modern period seem to want to be peppered with these additional moments of brutality? What does it say about our relationship with our history and also the way in which that relationship might be manipulated, that these moments are seen as necessary narrative devices? Following on from this line of inquiry about how history is represented in film and on TV, I began to think about the way in which we depict, describe and exhibit these moments of history in our tourism sites. I thought about, for example, the London dungeons, where there are many rooms that you could not throw a stone in without hitting some form of torture device or another. However, it's also happening in the heritage sites, the castles and the palaces. And of course, this is because it's what the public wants and expects. They want to see the torture chamber with all of the equipment laid out for their perusal. But does it matter that that equipment is probably a modern reproduction? Most of these devices don't exist anymore, if they ever existed in the first place. Is it also problematic that many of these objects and displays of objects are laid out without any real questioning of the provenance? And by that I mean, while absolutely torture happened and there are implements that we will clearly be able to see have a historical record for use, there are descriptions of torture equipment and devices that may have never existed. And these all too frequently sit alongside those where there is provenance. Why are we essentially set dressing our history with these props of misery? My concern with the way that torture is represented in film and TV and some tourism sites makes it seem that throughout our history, torture has been ubiquitous. That essentially there isn't a prison cell in the land where you wouldn't have found somebody hung up by their thumbs, being whipped and racked. And that's simply not the case. We are, and always have been, suspicious of torture. It was prohibited under common law without a royal warrant, and while that warrant was absolutely granted in certain cases, it was not ubiquitous and it was certainly not indiscriminate. The powers that be, then as much as now, understand that a confession or names of accomplices that are given under torture frequently lack the required veracity. If somebody is undergoing extraordinary pain, they will say whatever they think you want to hear to make that pain stop. Equally, while it was undeniably a more brutal time with the use of public executions and public shaming practices, they still want the belief that justice is being done. And if somebody goes to their public execution looking like they've been racked for weeks with the allegation that they have confessed, the public is going to think, well, of course they confessed. They were racked. And they will question whether justice is actually being done. And that is the last thing that any monarch or government is going to want. It's also, I think, worth mentioning that there is a form of torture, or as we may now call it, enhanced interrogation, that has been in existence throughout all of this time and continues to this day. If you need to get somebody to confess to something, if you want them to say exactly what you want them to say, you haven't got to touch them. You just have to stop them sleeping. During the witchcraft trials, there was a procedure known as walking the witch, where a person suspected of witchcraft would be made to walk for hours, days. Without sleep, the mind becomes confused and befuddled. It looks a lot like madness, and after a certain time, there isn't a reverse to that. It really damages the person psychologically. They will say and confess to anything you want to hear. So there wasn't really a need for this extraordinary violence when we have something that works just as effectively and doesn't leave a mark. Nevertheless, there are, of course, examples in our history where physical means of torture were undertaken, and I'm going to describe a few of them now. They are all from early modern England, from the reigns of Henry VIII up to James I. First up, we have Mark Smeaton, who in 1536 was taken by Thomas Cromwell to his home. There, Thomas Cromwell is believed to have taken a knotted rope and used it to apply pressure to Smeaton's eye. From there, Smeaton was taken to the Tower of London, where he was racked. During this torture, Smeaton confessed to having illegal sexual congress with Queen Anne Boleyn. He also named a number of other men who had likewise sinned with the Queen. At the time, people questioned his confession. They asserted that it must have been gained by torture. It is still widely discredited, as it was then. The use of torture in this case meant that people questioned his confession, and therefore the security of the conviction of Anne Boleyn and the men accused alongside her. A decade later, in 1546, it's a woman who finds herself on the receiving end of the torture chamber. Anne Askew was a reforming Protestant in the reign of Henry VIII, and she may well have had ties to Queen Catherine Parr. Perhaps the Conservative faction at court were hoping that Anne Askew might confess and give up those who believed like she did, and they would be able to bring down Catherine Parr. Askew was racked in the Tower of London. The Constable of the Tower was so disgusted by the notion of torturing women that he refused to be involved. But on hand were Risley and Rich, two court bully boys, to do the job for him. They racked Askew so ferociously that it said that her shoulders and hips dislocated. The people saw her unable to walk or lift her arms as she went to her execution by burning. The process of torture had elicited no confession, no recantation, and, vitally, no names. What it had made was Askew into a martyr, certainly not the intention of those who decided to torture her. In 1581, the Jesuit priest Edmund Campion is accused of having attempted to dethrone Elizabeth. The record states that he was placed in Little Ease, a room in the tower, which we don't know where it is now, that was so small you could neither stand up nor lay down comfortably. Additionally, at this time, it was said that he was placed on the rack. And while reports of his confession were made abroad, they were all shown later to have been false. Campion doesn't confess, and he is executed without having done so. The torture doesn't work. In 1594, another Catholic priest, John Gerard, was arrested in Elizabeth's England. He was allegedly hung in chains, so in manacles from the ceiling, so the full weight of his body is placed on his wrists. His hands would have lost sensation, he would have felt strain in his shoulders, and over time, this position can lead to something called positional asphyxia. The diaphragm is no longer able to work in the way it should. Nevertheless, John Gerard reports of his treatment because not only does the torture he undergoes at the tower not elicit a confession, recantation, or the names of accomplices, it doesn't even stop him from making a successful escape from the tower. Perhaps the most famous example of torture being used successfully in English history is when it was used against Guy Fawkes, one of the gunpowder plotters, in 1605. However, for him to sign his confession, it did take him being hung in manacles, racked, and placed in Little Ease. We can see from his signature after his time spent in the Tower of London that the torture must have been quite extreme. He can barely hold the quill to write his name. From the examples that I have just given, not only do they show that torture is a fairly hit and miss exercise when it comes to eliciting a confession or information about co-conspirators, it also clearly shows that there's not a great deal of diversity in the methods that were being used, certainly not as they are set down in the historical record. We see the rack, an object that arms and feet are held and pulled apart so that joints dislocate. We see manacles, as I said, hanging in chains, which can cause numbness in the hands, nerve damage, joint damage, and potentially positional asphyxia. And the use of this room, Little Ease. While the rack, the manacles, and Little Ease are certainly graphic and very, very unpleasant, these are not the implements that garner the most interest and attention in film, TV, or even arguably in exhibitions. Instead, it's reproductions of objects that, if they were used ever, were used very rarely. We have, for example, the boot, an object that is designed to contain the feet and legs, where wooden wedges are inserted and intend to damage and break the bones of the feet and lower legs. Also, thumb screws. They come up in film and TV quite a lot. They are designed to cause crush injuries to the hands and fingers. Then there's the breast ripper. This object would be superheated and used to tear the flesh of a woman's, particularly, breast. It would leave her disfigured and no doubt in extraordinary pain. Allegedly, this was used for women who were guilty of adultery. Also, the scavenger's daughter. This is designed to do exactly the opposite of the rack, to crumple the body. The head is in the top hole, the arms and feet in the lower holes. And this would be incredibly painful, of course. It would cause spinal injuries and also a risk of positional asphyxia. For these four objects, there are hints in reports that they may well have been employed at some points in our history, although it seems quite rarely, if at all. However, the next set of objects that feature prominently in film, TV, literature, and also in displays of torture equipment the world over, there is a massive question as to whether they existed at all. First up, we have a braising bull. This is a bronze bull which is placed over a fire. The intended torture or execution victim is placed inside, the fire is lit, and the person roasts. Also, the choke pear or the pear of anguish, which actually featured in an episode of Bones. This is intended to open either the mouth, potentially breaking the jaw, or it could be inserted and opened in other orifices, which sounds truly disturbing and terrifying. However, there is no evidence this ever actually existed or was used. In fact, even if it did exist, the type of pressure that would be required to screw something open in this way could not have achieved the types of injuries that it is described as having achieved. It simply wouldn't have been strong enough, for example, to break a jaw in the way described. What about the Iron Maiden? Perhaps the most feared of all medieval torture devices. We know how horrific it would have been to be enclosed in this spiked coffin. I mean, it's frightening enough that a band took their name from it. But all the evidence points to the fact that the Iron Maiden is in fact an invention of the 1800s, intended, we believe, to strike awe and fear about the brutality of the past. Last but not least, there is the pendulum, a device worthy of a Bond villain. A blade that swings back and forth as a rope lowers above the body of its victim, the intention being that it will saw a person in two. Not only is there no evidence it's ever existed in the medieval or early modern period, but had it existed, much like the choke pear or pear of anguish, it wouldn't have worked. A pendulum on a rope, unfortunately, as soon as it made contact with flesh, would stop. Undeniably, this would have been extraordinarily painful, but it doesn't have the capacity to saw a person in two, as those who are aficionados of historical torture would have you believe. Torture is undeniably a fact of our history. Unfortunately, in far too many places in the world, it is also a fact of our present. My question is, when we think about our own histories of torture, why is it seemingly rewarding to us that it be as varied and imaginative and gratuitous as we like to present it as having been? Why did people in the 1800s feel compelled to develop the Iron Maiden as if to make the past look more brutal and more frightening? Well, if we are going to look for a way to apportion blame for this explosion of torture devices, many of which were not and in fact could not have been used in the way described, we may have to go further back than the 1800s. In fact, we might have to look at our early modern counterparts. In the schisms of religion in Europe, where Catholic raged against Protestant, and where Protestant states found themselves under the threat of Spanish Inquisition, it's possible that a Protestant government might have thought it necessary to develop a propaganda piece, something like a pear of anguish or choke pear, that they could say had been found on board a Spanish ship or in the bag of an inquisitor, that they could show to their people as if to prove the barbarous and dangerous and ungodly nature of the Catholic states. Perhaps these governments felt that it would be a fine reason to generate more taxes, and the people would comply because they were so worried about the Catholic states. Maybe also those people would comply with being under greater surveillance because the Catholics may be among them, a threat to their future safety. I'd love to know what you think. Why do you think some people find torture so compelling in their interaction with and presentation of history? And what do you think the effect of this is on the way we interact with and view that history? Let me know in the comments section down below, or come and find me over on social media. I'll be leaving the links in the description box. You can follow me there and continue the conversation. I hope you found this video interesting and useful. If you did, please let me know by clicking the like button. Please also subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.